So this is my Sunday, and so I brought a sermon. And first of all, I just want to cue you into the fact that John and I, when we preach, we strive for originality. You know, we don't want to be same old, same old. And so I went to the Bible to find something really new and original. And in Ecclesiastes it says, there is nothing new under the sun. So that's what the writer of Ecclesiastes said, and I might point out he said it a real long time ago. So anyway, we do try to do our best when we preach. We have mixed reviews. That's the way it goes. Everyone has their own opinion. I heard about a preacher that when he finished his sermon after the service, a man came up to me. He said, that wasn't a bad sermon, but it was not original. He said, I have every single word of that sermon in a book at home. And the preacher says, well, I'd like to see that. He said, well, I'll bring it next Sunday. So next Sunday, he presented him with a dictionary. You see? Every word is right here, not original. Yeah, really. Yeah, that's what the preacher said. He said, that's bad. That's bad. Yeah. Now, on a little bit more serious subject, there is a pulpit in a chapel at Columbia Theological Seminary in Atlanta, Georgia, where I have never been. But there is a sign on that pulpit, and it's a brass plate with an inscription. It's been there a long time, and it says, "Sir, we want to see Jesus." And it is quoting John 12:21. In that story, some Greeks or Gentiles come to see Philip with that very request. He said, "Why are you here?" And they said, "Sir, we want to see Jesus." And as people reflected on that through the years, they thought, you know, that is something that needs to be on the pulpit. Because that's what it's all about. We're trying to get people to see Jesus, to experience Jesus. And so someone's at the door. And they're trying to get away. Catch them quick. So the question comes to me, you know, why would we want to see Jesus? What's the big deal? And the reason is that we want to know Jesus. Can you all say that with me? We want to know Jesus. All right. One more time. We want to know Jesus. All right. That's kind of our theme for this message. Now, to get that job done, the preachers use a lot of tools and tricks, and humor is one of them. And I do want to mention that it's been observed that Jesus was somewhat of a humorist. Now, you may not think that, but those who have studied it very deeply, at least some of them, believe that that is the case. In the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, it says, if there is a single person within the pages of the Bible that we can consider to be a humorist, it is without a doubt Jesus. There is a subtle, playful quality to his mind that is unmistakable and that emerges most clearly if we take time to distill his humorous sayings. Jesus was a master of wordplay, irony, and satire, often with humor intermixed. So, see, maybe we don't get the jokes, but they are there. And of course, they are ancient. They're, you know, about 2,000 years old. So it takes a little while to kind of get on that vibe, but there is humor there. And one example, if you can appreciate, you might have laughed at this when you read it yourself, that Jesus talked about a person swallowing a camel. You know, he said, you know, you strain out a gnat, you go to the trouble to strain out a gnat, and yet on the other hand, you swallow a camel. Now that's kind of funny if you think about it. And it was funnier 2,000 years ago. You had to be there. In thinking about using humor, that's a somewhat daunting task. I decided I would do some of that. And they all laughed when I said I wanted to be a comedian, but no one's laughing now. And chew on that a while. So I think about some of these old jokes, not as old as the 2,000 years old jokes, but the ones that we have passed around and laughed about and annoyed each other with. And I want to kind of use some of them as signposts in this message. The first one is the chicken joke. Why did the chicken cross the road? And there are a lot of answers to that. My answer today is the chicken crossed the road to get away from this old joke. And I think that's pretty good motivation. I might rephrase it a little bit. Why did the disciple cross the road? Why would a disciple cross the road? To follow Jesus. Yeah. And why would we follow Jesus? Because we want to know Jesus. Remember that? We want to know Jesus. And so we follow him to know him. We want to experience him, know him better. A lot of this following goes on in the New Testament, and a couple of quick stories about that I want to touch base with. The first one is in John, starting in the first chapter, verse 35. John, not the writer of the book, but John the baptizer, was standing with two of his followers, and Jesus walked by. Just sounds like a setup for a joke there, doesn't it? And when John saw him, he said, "Look, see God's Lamb." Now the two followers heard what John said, so they went after Jesus. And Jesus turned, he saw them coming after him, and he said to them, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "Teacher, where do you live?" He said, "Come and see." And they went and saw. Why did they go and see? Because we want to know Jesus. Yeah, they're disciples, we're disciples. I don't think there's much difference. Just a few years. In Matthew, similar things going on there. But we get some professions into this story that Jesus is walking by the Sea of Galilee. Apparently he did a lot of that walking. And he sees two brothers. There's Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. And they're fishermen. And Jesus says to them, "Come, follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people." So they've been fishing for fish. So they're going to get to keep fishing just now for people. And so what do? They say, "Get out of here, you are nuts." No, they didn't. Probably some people did say that, but they didn't say that. They said, "Let's go." And once they left their nets and they followed him. And then, the story doesn't end there. Going on from there, he sees two more brothers. And it's James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, and they're in a boat doing the same kind of thing. They're working on the fishing. They're fixing the nets. And Jesus calls them, and what do? They're just as crazy as the other two. They follow him. Immediately, they leave the boat, and they leave their father. He's sitting there with the net in hand. He said, "What happened?" And they follow Jesus. Now, why did they do that? Why did they go off and follow Jesus? Because we want to know Jesus. One more time. We want to know Jesus. Now, see, maybe you don't want to know Jesus, but I'm hypnotizing you. We'll get there in time for lunch. Okay. So here's another one. Jesus and 4 disciples walked into a bar. Okay? Now, why did the 4 disciples follow Jesus into the bar? Because we want to know Jesus. We'll follow him anywhere. That's what disciples do. Cross the street, into the bar, wherever we need to go to follow him. An important disciple in the New Testament is Saul of Tarsus, also known as Paul the Apostle. I guess that was his alias, Paul the Apostle. He was also into following Jesus. He uses a little different language, but he's definitely into it. Now, some people criticize Paul. There's been a lot of criticism, especially modern criticism of Paul. But it's been said you should never criticize someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes. Think about that, until you've walked a mile in their shoes. And at that point, then when you go to criticize, you'll be a mile away, and you'll have their shoes. So, keep that in mind. In Philippians, Paul talks some about his own story. He also talks about it in Galatians, but we'll save that for later. In Philippians chapter 3, starting with the 4th verse, he talks about his discipleship. First he talks about what came before, and then he talks about how he feels about it later. He says, we couldn't carry this off by our own efforts, and we know it, even though we can list what many might think are impressive credentials. You know my pedigree, a legitimate birth. Are we looking at this? Yeah. All right. Circumcised on the 8th day, an Israelite from the elite tribe of Benjamin, a strict and devout adherent to God's law, a fiery defender of the purity of my religion, even to the point of persecuting the church. What? Okay. A meticulous observer of everything set down in God's law book. The very credentials these people are waving around as something special, I'm tearing up and throwing out with the trash, along with everything else I used to take credit for. And by the way, I understand the word in Greek is actually stronger than trash. It's a step beyond trash. Yeah, we won't go there. And why? Why? Because of Christ. You saw that coming, didn't you? Yes, all the things I once thought were so important are gone from my life. Compared with the high privilege of knowing Christ Jesus as my master firsthand, everything I once thought I had going for me is insignificant dog dung. Oh, there, we did go there. We got there. I've dumped it all in the trash so that I could embrace Christ and be embraced by Him. I didn't want some petty, inferior brand of righteousness that comes from keeping a list of rules when I could get the robust kind that comes from trusting Christ, God's righteousness. I gave up all that inferior stuff so I could know Christ personally, experience His resurrection power, be a partner in His suffering, and go all the way with Him to death itself. If there was any way to get in on the resurrection from the dead, I wanted to do it. I'm not saying that I have this all together, that I haven't made, but I am well on my way reaching out to Christ, who has so wondrously reached out for me. Friends, don't get me wrong. By no means do I count myself an expert in all of this, but I've got my eye on the goal, where God is beckoning us onward to Jesus. I'm off and running, and I'm not turning back. Good words. Strong words. I'm impressed by Paul. And a lot of times people have, I think, misunderstood Paul. We thought, Paul's somebody that looked back and he just wept over his past and he just talked about how awful he'd been and what a worthless worm he was and all that. But I really don't catch that in the stuff that's actually from the pen of Paul. It's more that, this is how it was, it's my past. I'm going to really concentrate on what I am right here and where I'm going and who I'm serving. In the Biblical Imagery Dictionary, it talks about this image that he uses, the image of a race, the image of straining forward, pressing on toward a goal. It evokes the picture of a racer that looks neither to the left nor to the right to check the progress of the competition or be swayed by any diversion. That's Paul. He's got his eye on the prize. His eyes on the goalpost. And we're to imagine a runner leaning forward at the finish line in an added effort to be the first one to cross. although sort of the metaphor breaks down there because Paul wants us all to cross that finish line. He's not really too concerned about who does it first. He's just concerned about his own dedication to that task. Now, let's see, have we seen the picture up on that? Yeah, there it is. Do you all know who that is?
Stan Lee.
That's Stan Lee, right. And does anybody know what Stan Lee's real name is?
Stan Lee.
It's Stanley Lieber. That's his actual name. That's the name that he saved for the great American novel which he never wrote. But that's the way he told his story. He wound up doing a lot of writing of comic books. That's what he really wrote. And Stan Lee had these different slogans, and this was one of them. Face front, true believers. And he would say that often, and probably too often, kind of pulling on his military experience. He was a World War II soldier, and he used some of that in his work. The idea, to me, of facing front is being called to attention, and we as soldiers don't always pay attention. When I was in Navy boot camp, we learned about how to march around together and get hot in the Florida sun, and we got pretty good at it. And then once we got out of boot camp, I think I marched maybe once more in 4 years. So anyway, but we learned how to do what we were told, and we learned how to do it together. We learned how to face front. We learned how to pay attention and not be distracted by the person on this side or the person behind us or whatever was going on. The sun beating down on you and the sun trickling down your back, you learned it. Did I say sweat trickling down your back? That's what I meant to say. Because it was. That's what Stan Lee is telling his fans to do. Pay attention and buy my comics. That's what he's saying. And they did. People did. And now they turned into movies. And he took over the movie industry. Right? So, it's not just to the fans of Marvel Comics and Stan Lee that face front goes forth, but I think to all of us. We need to face front too in our discipleship. And why do you think we need to face front? Because we want to know Jesus. All right. Another kind of joke. Knock, knock. Yeah, don't you hate those jokes? We used to play with making up our own. And I remember one of the kids said to me, knock, knock. I said, who's there? And she said, stupid. Stupid who? You're stupid, get it? Right. That was a good one. It was not you. But in the scriptures, knock, knock. Jesus. And he says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. Yeah, you've read that, haven't you? It's right there in Revelation 3:20. He knocks so that we might open. And when is a door not a door?
When it's a jar.
When it's ajar. And why is the door ajar? Because you opened. Jesus knocked. You opened. The door became ajar. And Jesus says, if anyone opens to me, I will come in and have fellowship with him. Open the door? Why would I get up and go open the door? Why would I go the trouble to let someone in? Simple, because we want to know Jesus. Yes, we do. In a similar vein, Jesus says, whenever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there in their midst. And 2 or 3 are gathered here in his name. And therefore, according to Jesus, he is here in our midst. Now, why would we gather in his name? That sounds like a lot of trouble. We could be watching Laurel and Hardy at home on the television.
I'd rather be here.
Huh. Why? Why do you want to be here? Because we want to know Jesus. Yes. All right. Now, what's black and white and red all over? That's another old joke. The newspaper, the sunburned zebra. The Bible. Black and white and red all over. Let's read it together. Oh, that's what we've been doing. That's what we've been doing here in this message and in this service. Yeah, and then once we have read it together, then we can work on living it together. Well, why? It sounds like a lot of trouble, a distracting thing. We want to do that because we want to know Jesus. Now I challenge you to look around. Look at those around you, your right and your left and behind. Don't face front for a moment. And who do you see? You see the body of Christ. You see Jesus with us. And as we know one another, we know Him. And I say it in His name. Amen.